CFIUS and Sanctions, and we were looking at doing it as two events, and then we were trying to do it as one event. We finally landed where we are, and I am absolutely thrilled to get this panel together. I am always, it's always a pleasure for me also to introduce our moderator, Bill Reinsch. Bill is an old friend and a mentor of mine, has worked on all of these issues for many years, and I'm thrilled to have him join us. If any of you ever get the chance and have some time in your long commutes in the rain in DC, listening to a podcast is one of my favorite things to do. And one of my new favorites is CSIS has a new podcast called The Trade Guys. If you ever get a chance to listen to that, Bill and Scott Miller do a fantastic job explaining trade policy in a way that's very accessible, I think, for a lot of people outside of DC. So I hope you'll pass that word along. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Bill, and he'll introduce our panel.
Thank you. Yes, listen to the Trade Guys. Personally, I listen to Lithium on Sirius XM, but may or may not be an improvement. Delighted to be here. We have an expert panel. I don't want to cut into their time by saying very much. Let me just set the stage for a minute. First, Chris and I were talking on the way out, and I want to endorse his comments on export controls. I think he and I both agree we are the town champions on failure when it comes to export control reform. I've been involved in 13 of those efforts, only 5 of which succeeded, and the last one was in 1987, so you can see that, and I had nothing to do with this one, which may tell you something, but it certainly was a case of stars aligning on a responsible product, and one that I think we can contrast in some respects with Sanctions. We may get into that, but I think our panelists are going to focus primarily on sanctions, which is, as you might say, a target-rich environment these days. There's been an expansion of sanctions activity recently for a variety of reasons. I would just suggest that there's several overarching themes that I hope our panelists will comment on. If they don't, I'll ask them. The two, one is an old one and one is a relatively new one. The old one is collateral damage. When you mess with the market, there are always things that happen that you don't expect. If you're good in the government, you try to anticipate everything and act knowing what the effects are going to be, so that you're at least doing a responsible job. Even if you do the best job possible, there's going to be unexpected outcomes, as was discovered, as was mentioned in the previous panel. Eventually, people find ways to game the system. In the short run, people discover that they've been wiped out by the system unexpectedly, and when they weren't paying attention, and didn't seize the opportunity to come in and lay out their issues. So collateral damage is one issue that I hope our panelists will address, whether that's a bigger problem now than it used to be. I think the other trend is that sanctions have gotten a lot more complicated over the years. When I started in this business, we call them the sledgehammer approach. You just had an embargo, you had whole sectors that were off limits, and we've been transitioning, beginning in the Bush administration, to targeted sanctions, and particularly targeted financial sanctions, which adds whole layers of complexity to the regime, and I hope our people will comment on that in the Iran, Russia, other country context. But in turn, complexity leads to compliance issues, and that has become a whole new, I wouldn't say new, but a huge growth area in law firms. In addition to being at CSIS, I'm also at Kelly Dry, which has a practice in export controls and sanctions, and the practice is mostly compliance. And the clients are in 3 categories. The people that have been indicted and have to deal with it, people that are afraid they're going to be indicted and want to make sure that doesn't happen, and the people that don't want to fall into either of the other 2 categories and want to take prophylactic measures. To the extent that the sanctions regimes get more and more complicated, compliance gets more and more difficult. And I'm hoping our panelists will also comment on that as well. And finally, there were some good words said in the last panel about bipartisanship and cooperation. I think FIRMA was a good example, both of bipartisan cooperation with Congress and also of constructive working relationship between the legislative branch of the government and the executive branch of the government. The record of sanctions in that latter area has been uneven, and particularly currently on Russia sanctions, and in some respects on Iran sanctions. There have been fairly sharp differences of view, both amongst members of Congress and between the two branches of government. And so perhaps our panelists will get into that issue as well. So with that, I'm not going to introduce them with extended bios. You've got all those bios. We have people that have long experience in this issue, both in private practice and in the government. Ryan actually, I think, could have served admirably on either panel, but we got him. Peter had a distinguished record in the last administration of dealing with very complicated issues. Suzanne's been addressing these issues in the private sector and in think tanks for a very long time. I think we first met when you were with ExxonMobil, and you moved on. We both moved on to other things. So we'll go in the order that you're listed, starting with Brian.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you to Ken for organizing this today. Very happy to be here this morning. I think to address your first theme, collateral damage, being in private practice here in DC and dealing with these issues day in, day out, I think that's really my bread and butter. So I'm going to spend most of my time probably talking about complexity and collateral damage. My background was originally in sanctions, was in the enforcement space at the Justice Department, and then in later years working on policy and implementation matters. And I have the distinct pleasure, perhaps that's too strong a word, of having been part of the contingent that in 2016, after implementation day, was with colleagues from OFAC and State Department traveling around to speak with companies and banks all around the world to explain to them the nature of the secondary sanctions relief and what perhaps they could consider doing in Iran at the time. And now, being on the other side of it, I'm receiving frantic phone calls from companies all around the world who are concerned about whether they can wind down their operations in Iran before the end of the 180-day period. So I've seen both sides of it, and I'm seeing it. I think on that goes for Russia as well. I think similar concerns, confusion, and complexities there. And I actually want to start with Russia. And to Bill's point about the complexity issue, I think so COTS has now been on the books for just over a year. This is, of course, the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, for those who don't know the acronym. And although that targeted multiple countries, I think the main focus, at least on in the compliance community and the legal community in the trade space, has really been on the effects that it's had on Russia, and in particular on the effects that it's had outside the U.S. and particularly in Europe and Asia. COTS obviously expanded the Russia sanctions quite significantly, and to use just one example that some of you I know for a fact in this room are familiar with, there's restrictions, potential sanctions liability through the secondary sanctions that can come to those who engage in quote-unquote significant transactions with parties that are subject to the Russia sanctions. And so that, I think, has become emblematic of how difficult it is really for companies to, as a compliance matter, as a sanctions compliance matter, to wrestle with these issues. Even the most well-meaning companies who want to have a good compliance system in place, who want to stay on the right side of U.S. sanctions, are, quite frankly, continue to be vexed by those questions. What is a significant transaction? There are no regs on that as of now. There's an FAQ from OFAC that those of us who do this quote often, but that provides a lot of discretion. And even though these are supposedly mandatory sanctions, there's just tons of discretion ultimately for the U.S. regulators to potentially impose secondary sanctions liability. And so that's had, from my vantage point, quite a crippling effect on again, a lot of collateral damage, I think, in a number of ways, not only for companies who are themselves trying to figure out how they can actually assess their own risk when there's so much uncertainty built into that construct of what is a significant transaction, But also, I think, more broadly speaking, when you look at certainly financial institutions all in Western Europe especially, but in other well-developed parts of the world, the de-risking that we've seen in that space has been very aggressive, accelerated perhaps even in the past couple of years. And so even for companies who believe that they're doing the right thing, believe that they're being sanctions compliant, if there's any whiff of a transaction, a business dealing with somebody in Russia, certainly with anybody who's an SDN or is owned by an SDN, that creates massive problems for them in terms of access to capital, payment processing, etc. Because banks are so quick to balk at any connections in that vein. Similarly, on supply chain, for any companies that are, I've had clients who've run into issues with suppliers who just refuse to continue to honor their obligations because of a stated fear of secondary sanctions. In terms of the recourse there, what can be done? It's we've tried. We've had meetings. We've had calls. We've sought guidance from OFAC and the State Department where appropriate. There's only so much you can do, and ultimately it's that other company's decision oftentimes where their own risk tolerance is, and if you're not going to move them off of that, then you're really going to have some difficulties. So COTS has been a real game changer. It's been introduced a lot of complexity into this space. The other big event that I will point to with respect to the Russia sanctions was April 6th when the oligarch designations came down. A number of very well-known, wealthy, high-profile Russian oligarchs, in addition to the companies that they own, added to the SDN list, and then that has had ripple effects, I think, unintended by, maybe off the record, I've heard this from folks at OFAC, beyond what they could have imagined. And obviously, there have been some mechanisms that have been put in place in terms of general licenses and things that allowed certainly U.S. companies and also companies abroad to continue some of those relationships, but time is running short on those general licenses. The most October 23rd is the date on several of the big ones that touch on Rusal and some of the other bigger players that were affected by the sanctions. So people are looking very closely at what's going on in terms of divestitures and other things that could potentially change the status of some of these entities, but I think by no means is that a certainty that that's going to be resolved by the end of October. So you may be looking at a situation where those general licenses are extended. If things are looking bleak, they may be abandoned altogether, and then a lot of people will be left to scramble if they have to replace those relationships and look to determine what their own sort of risk tolerance is there in terms of going forward. And so I would say those things before I transition to Iran, just to say one thing that you see certainly in the media a lot is that the administration has not necessarily lived up to perhaps what is expected or wanted of it with respect to the sanctions on Russia. That's a whole separate panel, obviously. But I think that there has been while there have not been we haven't seen sort of sanctions coming at anybody who's run afoul of these provisions thus far. Obviously they are continuing to designate people. They are continuing to hold out the prospect that they will add to those designations, which will further complicate things and have additional ripple effects. And then for all the reasons that I referenced before, I do think that there is a lot of self-policing and self-regulation of this from a compliance standpoint because of how complex those risk questions are. So I think companies around the world, certainly companies in Western Europe that I've worked with and in Asia, to a lesser extent, but in the more well-developed parts of Asia that perhaps we have closer ties to, there are these are things that are being discussed and thought about constantly. With respect to Iran, I'll first address very quickly perhaps what the impact has been since the announcement on May 8th of the withdrawal from the JCPOA and the reimposition of sanctions on from the U.S. perspective, and then I will broaden to EU countries and beyond. So obviously, with the biggest perhaps practical impact with respect to the reimposition of sanctions and the withdrawal from the JCPOA is the fact that General License H, which allowed U.S.-based companies to have their foreign subs do business in Iran if they were sort of properly walled off, to shorthand it, that's gone away. And these companies are now in an aggressive wind down to get out as quickly as they can. Candidly, from the discussions that I had with companies who were considering doing this, many of them found it to be too onerous a prospect from both a compliance risk and business risk perspective, because they just couldn't, to cede the amount of control they would have to cede in order to do the business and do it in a way that was compliant with the general license was going to be very challenging. And I think many people considered it. I don't know how many people actually took the plunge. Anecdotally, I know that there are at least some that did. But I think that many who did also saw the writing on the wall, perhaps a few months before the May 8th announcement, that this is where things were heading, and they may have started to put in place contingency plans for how they could withdraw. But that is, the wind down and the withdrawal process is a complicated one. And to extend that now to non-U.S. companies that are perhaps most directly in the crosshairs on the reimposed sanctions, winding down, I think by and large, most of the companies that I've talked to have made a decision that they are going to wind down and get out, even if they believe perhaps that they could continue to do lawful business in Iran that would not run afoul of U.S. sanctions. There are just too many complications. And again, banking relationships are going to potentially be jeopardized, and there's just a lot at stake from a sort of brand management perspective that a lot of companies just don't want to deal with. And so I think by and large, winding down has been the choice. That being said, even those who are pursuing that aggressively, there are a lot of factors that they have to look into. They have contractual obligations. They have perhaps people on the ground. They have a lot of things that they have to wrestle with. So even if they're pursuing it as quickly as they can, it's very complicated. And again, going to the U.S. regulators to seek guidance on that, I did this when I was in government, and of course OFAC and state do this now, which is they encourage you to come in, they encourage you to ask questions, they encourage you, especially when you feel like you're between the sort of proverbial rock and a hard place, to talk through these issues with them, and that's all well and good, but as we know, and as I'm sure my fellow panelists are going to address, the climate now, especially in the current administration, with anything in respect to Iran, is pretty toxic, and there's very low tolerance for or empathy for people who are doing this business. So I think it's very complicated even for companies that are really trying to do the right thing and stay on the right side of the regulators. So I'll just offer two last quick comments before I hand over the microphone. One is, I believe Chris mentioned in the last panel, the idea of staying away from unilateral action in the CFIUS realm with respect to outbound investment. Obviously, the administration is doing the exact opposite here. People who held up the JCPOA as a success of multilateral sanctions to yield a result with the nuclear deal. Obviously, that is not what we have now. We are going it alone, purely unilateral, and I think a lot of people with good reason are very skeptical of what that's really going to accomplish. And then the last thing I would say is, as a former enforcement person at the Justice Department, enforcement on the sanctions side has been relatively low this year. There has been only one publicly acknowledged enforcement action by OFAC so far this year, and that had to do with violations of the Sudan sanctions, which is not even really, are not in effect really anymore. So it's been relatively light on the enforcement front. I think that, I don't know that that's sort of part of a grand plan to just, give that up as part of the strategy. But I do think there's naturally going to be a lag with respect to the new Russia sanctions, with respect to the Iran sanctions, before we see some of that kick up. Again, I do think that to the extent that regulators are hoping people are going to self-police and change conduct to comply, I do think by and large that is what's happening around the world. So to that extent, I do think that these are having a big impact. And with that, I'll stop and I'll hand the mic over to Peter.
Okay, Peter?
No, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And Ken, thank you very much for the invitation, and Bill for chairing this panel. I thought I would make just a couple of minutes of brief remarks on several themes and trends that I see in the Trump administration's use of sanctions over the last year and a half, and in those remarks touch on a couple of the questions that Bill threw out at the opening of the panel. And I guess to start, the first trend we see under the Trump administration, it kind of goes without saying, is a very aggressive use of sanctions, pretty much across the board. You know, I served, as Bill mentioned, in the Obama administration, and I used to be on the receiving end of kind of, I wouldn't quite call them complaints, but verging on complaints that Obama used sanctions too much. But I suspect most companies kind of miss the good old Obama days in terms of the pace of use of sanctions, because Trump has certainly ramped it up. You see that empirically. I mean, in his first year in office, OFAC added just over 1,000 new individuals and entities to U.S. sanctions list, which was an increase of about 30% over the 2016 number. We'll probably be on pace, OFAC is probably on pace to add a similar number this year. I remember talking late June or maybe right after July 4th with a very senior OFAC official who mentioned in kind of an offhand way at the end of the meeting that it was, you know, a nice time because it had been the first week in 4 or 5 months when there wasn't a tranche of designations that had been announced. You know, so we're seeing a very aggressive pace of use. We're obviously also seeing an aggressive use of new and expanded programs. And it goes without saying, we've seen an expansion of the Russia sanctions program, both by Congress and by the executive branch, notably with the April 6 designations that Brian mentioned. And with Iran, obviously, we're seeing a very dramatic reimposition of sanctions. But we've also seen the Trump administration move quite aggressively on North Korea-related sanctions, including a number of designations of companies, people in China. Trump administration has really embraced the Venezuela sanctions program. We've seen a qualitative as well as quantitative increase of pressure there. So I think we're seeing, you know, continued pretty dramatic expansion of sanctions programs. I should also mention, of course, Trump has shown himself to be much more willing to kind of merge what you might call a range of coercive economic tools into the sanctions framework. I thought it was interesting that they used Section 232 steel and aluminum tariff levels on tariffs, clearly in kind of on Turkey, clearly in kind of a sanctions context, even though legally that was not how they defended it. But I think you are seeing and are going to continue to see kind of a merger of these different kinds of tools. As Brian mentioned, we are seeing a fairly sharp willingness to exercise unilateral power and unilateral sanctions. I don't actually see the Trump administration as anti-multilateral when it comes to sanctions. You know, with North Korea, they clearly drove much of their policy through the UN Security Council. On Venezuela as well, they have mounted some international diplomatic initiatives to get both the European Union and Latin America and Canada on board with some sanctions, not what the U.S. has, but some sanctions. So I don't think they're anti-multilateral, but they are clearly very comfortable with unilateral U.S. economic power. And when they see what's happening on Iran or Russia, or some of these other cases where there isn't much multilateral action, I think they see a lot of corporate compliance around the world, and there's a strong sense that unilateral power is working, at least in achieving near-term economic and business impacts. And so I think we're likely to see continued comfort with unilateral power over the next year or two. In terms of collateral damage, Brian mentioned the impact of the April 6th Russia sanctions on Oleg Deripaska, the oligarch, Rusal, a couple of other Russian individuals and companies. And I think clearly, as Brian said, my sense as well, I think the administration was somewhat surprised by the scope of some of those impacts. As one official at the State Department put it to me months later, they kind of, going back to the old Rumsfeld, non-Rumsfeld frame, there were known unknowns. They knew there were a bunch of unknowns, but I think nonetheless they were surprised to see aluminum prices spike, 20-25% in 2 weeks, to discover that, Rusal owned plants in Jamaica and Ireland, and so you have all these governments coming in and complaining. That said, I think that overall the administration feels they've been able to mitigate the collateral costs reasonably effectively through some of the licenses that Brian mentioned. I think they recognize it's been bumpy, but I think they feel like, this has come through okay, which I think raises the question. I think there'd be some comfort with similar kinds of actions in the future, and with the idea that they could muddle through future collateral costs as well. So I think things are going to continue to be interesting coming out of the administration. Just briefly on Congress, obviously an important player here, and Bill had asked before the panel that if we could talk a little bit about the relationship. Clearly, we're seeing Congress being pretty active, particularly on Russia sanctions. I'm not sure if we'll actually see Congress enact more Russia sanctions this calendar year, only because the legislative clock on the House side in particular is just very, very short. But if we don't see Congress enact more legislative sanctions on Russia this year, I think it's simply a matter of timing, and there'd be a very high likelihood of another round of congressional sanctions on Russia sometime in 2019. Also just touching briefly on enforcement, which I think is an important issue Brian brought up at the end. It has been notable to see there's really only one new enforcement action published this year. Last year there were 16, which was a more kind of normal caseload on OFAC enforcement actions. Like Brian, I don't think OFAC is backing off on enforcement. I think there's kind of an inherent time lag in a lot of these things. But I do think if you look at the last couple of years on enforcement actions, and including the one action this year, the Sudan action, I think we are seeing OFAC in many of the actions kind of taking what I would actually characterize as a pretty reasonable approach. I think a lot of companies, sort of eyes are still in shock over the multi-billion-dollar bank fines that have been paid out in sort of 2010 to 2016 period, and with the very large ZTE fine last year. But if you look at a lot of the OFAC enforcement actions, the fines are in the kind of $100,000 to $1 million range. I think the median last year was probably about $400,000 or $500,000. And I think what that said, those are significant sums, but they're not, the sort of jaw-dropping, headline-grabbing sums that I think most people think about. And I think it shows that in enforcement, where a company hasn't acted with a whole lot of malice, and maybe does self-disclosure and overhauls their compliance program, we are seeing the enforcement officials take a more reasonable approach. Final point on the kind of growing complexity, and boy do we all see growing complexity